The maid is humiliated by her employers and wins the lottery, then decides. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The aroma of freshly made soup filled the kitchen of the Rodman mansion. Abigail, a 25-year-old maid with dreams bigger than her apron, meticulously attended to every detail of the dish. Her hands, rough from hard work, trembled slightly as she served the soup in fine porcelain bowls. Miss Rodman, a 40-year-old woman whose external beauty contrasted with the bitterness in her heart, took the first spoonful. Her face twisted in disgust. "This is inedible," she yelled, throwing the spoon against the plate. "Are you trying to poison us with so much salt?" Abigail felt as though she had been slapped. Years of humiliation condensed into that moment, and a spark of defiance ignited in her eyes. Mr. Rodman, a businessman more concerned with his investments than family peace, tried to calm the situation with a weak, "It's not that bad, dear." But the damage was already done. Mrs. Rodman continued her tirade, pointing out every imagined flaw in Abigail's work. Each word was a whip, leaving invisible scars on the young maid's soul. As Abigail picked up the plates with trembling hands and a heart pounding with rage and helplessness, she overheard a conversation between the Rodmans. They were whispering tensely about debts, gambling, and businesses on the verge of collapse. The facade of the perfect family crumbled before her eyes. That night, alone in her small room, Abigail wept, not just from the humiliation but from the revelation that her oppressors were as fragile as she was. Revenge, a thought she had never harbored before, began to germinate in her mind. She fell asleep with a new resolve: she would no longer be the victim in this story. The sun barely peeked through the silk curtains as Abigail began her daily chores in the Rodman mansion. Her movements were mechanical, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. While cleaning Mr. Rodman's study, a glint caught her eye. There, almost hidden among disorganized papers, lay a lottery ticket. Abigail picked it up with trembling hands, her heart racing. For a moment, she imagined a different life, far from oppression and humiliation. Without a second thought, she slipped the ticket into her apron pocket. She had barely finished cleaning when she heard. In a moment of weakness, Abigail almost confessed. The words were on the tip of her tongue when Mrs. Rodman slapped her, accusing her again of theft. "You're a thief, an ungrateful one. You should be thankful we give you a job." Something broke inside Abigail. Compassion gave way to resolve. It was no longer just about her or her brother, it was about every humiliation, every injustice. That night, staring at the ticket under the moonlight, Abigail made her decision. She would no longer be the victim. The money would be hers, and with it, the freedom she had longed for. Whatever the consequences, she would face them head-on. Fate had placed this opportunity in her hands, and she wouldn't let it slip away. For the first time in years, Abigail fell asleep with a smile on her lips, dreaming of a bright future for herself and her brother. The unexpected arrival of Maid Lane, the Rodman's daughter, shook the already tense atmosphere in the mansion. Freshly graduated from university abroad, Maid Lane brought with her a breath of fresh air and a keen eye that quickly noticed the cracks in the family's facade. Abigail watched cautiously as Maid Lane moved through the house, her eyes catching details that others overlooked. The young woman seemed different from her parents, showing a kindness Abigail wasn't accustomed to receiving from the Rodman family. "Is everything all right, Abigail?" Maid Lane asked one day, surprising the maid with her genuine concern. "You seem worried." Abigail felt the words stick in her throat. For a moment, she considered confessing everything, seeking solace in Madeleine's apparent understanding. But the memory of past humiliations sealed her lips. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rodman, consumed by the loss of the ticket, made a drastic decision. Abigail overheard her on the phone, hiring a private investigator to find the missing ticket. Panic swept over Abigail. With trembling hands, she hid the ticket in a place she thought was safe, praying no one would find it. Every sound, every glance became a potential threat. At night, When the house slept, Abigail would sneak out, planning her escape. She researched how to claim the prize without arousing suspicion, imagining a life free from the Rodmans' oppression. But guilt and fear gnawed at her. She saw the worry in Madeleine's eyes, the growing desperation on Mr. Rodman's face, and felt the weight of her secret crushing her. While Madeleine argued with her parents, the words debts, casino, and bankruptcy floated to Abigail's ears. She realized that the ticket wasn't just her salvation, but could also be the Rodmans' ruin. With her heart racing and her mind in a whirlwind, Abigail wondered if she had gone too far to turn back. The prize promised freedom, but the moral cost grew with each passing day. Paranoia enveloped the Rodman mansion like an invisible dense fog. Abigail felt invisible eyes following her every move. The private investigator, a man with a somber appearance, loitered around the house. His presence was a silent threat that sent shivers down the young maid's spine. In a moment of weakness, Abigail visited her brother in the hospital. Seeing him connected to the machines, his small body struggling to grow, she nearly broke down. The words crowded in her throat, the confession ready to spill out, but seeing the hope in her brother's eyes, she bit her tongue. The treatment was his only chance, and she had the means to provide it. Back at the mansion, tensions reached a boiling point. Mrs. Rodman, with pronounced dark circles and trembling hands, gathered all the staff. Her voice, usually authoritarian, quivered with a mix of desperation and fury. "I know one of you has my ticket," she declared, her eyes scanning the frightened faces. "If the culprit doesn't confess right now, I'll report you all for theft." The ensuing silence was deafening. Abigail felt her heart pounding so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. Her eyes briefly met Madeleine's, who looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and concern. That night, locked in her small room, Abigail packed her suitcase with trembling hands. The idea of running away, disappearing with the ticket, had never been so tempting. She could start a new life, free from oppression and fear. But as she contemplated that possibility, her brother's face appeared in her mind. What would happen to him if she disappeared? And what satisfaction would she get from seeing Mrs. Rodman's face when she discovered her insignificant maid had won millions? With her heart torn between the desire to escape and the need to face the consequences of her actions, Abigail sat on the edge of her bed, the lottery ticket burning in her hands like a promise of freedom and a chain of guilt. Dawn found Abigail with shattered nerves and unshakable determination. She had made her decision, she would escape that very night with the winning ticket. Moving cautiously, she packed the essentials in a small suitcase and hid it under her bed. Throughout the day, Abigail went about her chores with feigned calm, her heart pounding with every suspicious glance. The Rodman mansion had become a minefield of tension and veiled accusations. When the clock struck 11, Abigail slipped out of her room, suitcase in hand and the ticket hidden in her bra. The silence of the sleeping house was oppressive, every creak of the floor was a threat of being discovered. As she reached the foyer, a voice emerged from the shadows. In a moment of desperation, the words poured out of her like a torrent. She confessed everything, the ticket, the prize, her motives. The investigator listened in silence, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated consideration. When Abigail finished, breathless and on the verge of tears, he spoke in a low but firm voice. "I have a proposal for you," he said, stepping closer. "I can help you claim that prize without anyone knowing. I have the necessary contacts. In return, of course, I'll receive a generous compensation." Abigail stared at him in astonishment. The offer was tempting, a way out of her dilemma. But could she trust this man? Was she jumping from one problem into an even bigger one? With her heart in her throat and her mind in turmoil, Abigail faced a decision that would change the course of her life forever. The clock kept ticking mercilessly, and Abigail knew there was no turning back. Abigail's decision to accept the investigator's proposal set off a whirlwind of events. By dawn, the Rodman mansion was plunged into chaos. Mrs. Rodman, upon discovering Abigail's disappearance, flew into a frenzy of rage and panic. "That thief took my ticket!" she roared, her face contorted with fury. Mr. Rodman, pale and disheveled, tried in vain to calm her while making frantic calls to his contacts. Meanwhile, Abigail and the investigator were racing against time. They traveled in a run-down car on back roads, avoiding the main routes. Abigail, with her heart in her throat, constantly checked the rearview mirror, fearing to see pursuit lights. "I have a friend at the lottery office," the investigator explained as he drove. "He'll help us claim the prize without raising suspicion, but we have to hurry." Guilt gnawed at Abigail. She thought of her brother, of the promise of a better future, but she also remembered the humiliations, the cruel treatment from Mrs. Rodman. Every mile away from the mansion was a mixture of relief and remorse. At the mansion, Maid Lane watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of horror and suspicion. She knew Abigail well enough to believe she wasn't just a simple thief. Something more was happening, and she was determined to find out. "Dad," Maid Lane interrupted another of her father's frantic calls. "What's really going on? Why is that ticket so important?" Mr. Rodman looked at her, the weight of years of lies and secrets reflected in his tired eyes. He was about to confess everything when the phone rang. It was the police. Someone had seen Abigail and the investigator together. The news spread like wildfire. Unaware of this, Abigail clung to the ticket as the car devoured miles. Her future, and the futures of many others, hung by an increasingly thin thread. As she and the investigator neared their destination, the Rodman mansion became an emotional battleground. When Abigail and the investigator arrived at the lottery office, her heart pounded in her chest. Upon entering the building, the investigator's friend, a nervous-looking man, greeted them with a tense smile. "We need to act quickly," he murmured. "Questions are already being asked about this ticket." Just when everything seemed to be going according to plan, Abigail noticed something strange in the friend's behavior. His eyes avoided hers, and his hands trembled slightly as he handled the ticket. A chill ran down Abigail's spine. She was about to be betrayed again. At that moment, the office doors burst open. Mrs. Rodman, with bloodshot eyes and disheveled hair, stormed into the room, closely followed by the police. "There she is!" she shouted, pointing at Abigail. "She stole my ticket." Chaos erupted. Abigail, paralyzed by fear, watched as her dream of freedom evaporated before her eyes. The investigator, revealing his true nature, tried to sneak away amidst the confusion. In the tumult, Abigail's eyes briefly met Mrs. Rodman's. She didn't just see anger in them, but also desperation and fear. The realization hit her, everyone was a victim of their own desperate decisions. The chaos in the lottery office dissipated as quickly as it had begun. Abigail, the investigator, and the Rodmans were taken to the local police station for questioning. The tension was palpable in the small waiting room where they all sat, avoiding eye contact. Abigail, handcuffed and with her heart sinking, watched as her dream of a better life slipped from her grasp. The investigator, sitting in a corner, muttered to his lawyer while casting furtive glances toward her. Mrs. Rodman, stripped of her usual arrogance, looked like a shadow of her former self. Her makeup, smeared from tears, revealed a vulnerable and frightened woman. Mr. Rodman, on the other hand, sat with his head in his hands, visibly crushed by the weight of his decisions. Maid Lane arrived shortly after, her eyes red from crying. She looked at Abigail with a mixture of disappointment and compassion before sitting next to her parents. The silence was broken by the arrival of a police officer. "The ticket," he announced, "is authentic, and the winner." The news hit like a bomb. Mrs. Rodman jumped from her seat, claiming her right to the prize. Abigail, summoning all her courage, spoke for the first time since her arrest. "I found it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It was lying in the study, forgotten among the papers." The officer looked at both women, then at the ticket. "This will have to be resolved in court," he finally declared. The revelation that the ticket was the winner of the grand prize sparked a media frenzy. Journalists swarmed outside the police station, eager to capture every detail of the story. Abigail was released on bail, surprisingly paid by Maid Lane. As she left the station, Abigail faced cameras and microphones. The questions rained down on her. Why did you do it? Do you regret it? What do you plan to do with the money if you win the case? Overwhelmed, Abigail could only murmur. I just wanted a better life for my brother and me. As she walked away from the crowd, Abigail realized that her life would never be the same. The ticket that promised freedom had become a chain that bound her to an uncertain and turbulent future. The final confrontation took place in the Rodman mansion, now the epicenter of a scandal that shook society. Abigail, armed with the truth and backed by lawyers hired by Maid Lane, faced the family that had belittled her for years. The Grand Hall, once the scene of lavish parties, was now an emotional battlefield. Mrs. Rodman, stripped of her haughtiness, looked at Abigail with a mixture of hatred and desperation. You're a traitor, she whispered, after everything we've done for you. Abigail, with a calmness that surprised even herself, replied. What you've done for me? You mean the insults, the humiliations, the treatment like a slave? Mr. Rodman, sunk into his favorite chair, seemed to have aged years in just a few days. With a broken voice, he began to reveal the truth about his crumbling empire, the suffocating debts, and how the lottery ticket was their last hope. Maid Lane, standing between her parents and Abigail, listened in horror as years of lies and facades crumbled before her eyes. How could you? Maid Lane asked, tears sliding down her cheeks. How could you deceive all of us? The tension peaked and Abigail's lawyer presented evidence of embezzlement and tax evasion by the Rodmans. Mr. Rodman, seeing his world collapse, suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be attended to by paramedics. Amid the chaos, Abigail found herself face to face with Mrs. Rodman. For a moment, she saw in her former boss's eyes not just anger, but also a flash of recognition, as if for the first time she saw her as a human being. What do you really want? Mrs. Rodman asked, her voice barely a whisper. Abigail, with her heart racing, replied. Justice and the chance for a dignified life, something you've always denied me. The silence that followed was deafening. Maid Lane, making a decision, approached Abigail. I think it's time we all face the truth, she said, looking at her parents, and the consequences of our actions. While the lawyers discussed the terms of a possible settlement, Abigail realized that this bitter victory was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward redemption and true justice. The days following the confrontation at the Rodman mansion were a whirlwind of legal and media activity. Abigail, now at the center of public attention, found herself navigating a completely new and terrifying world. With part of the lottery money, which had been frozen pending the legal resolution, Abigail hired an elite team of lawyers. The young woman who once scrubbed floors now sat in luxurious offices discussing legal strategies that would determine her future. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rodman, consumed by revenge, played her own hand on the board. In a desperate act, she tried to sabotage Abigail's brother's medical treatment by bribing a nurse to alter his medication. When Abigail learned of this attempt, something inside her broke. The guilt and remorse she had felt evaporated, replaced by cold determination. If they want a war, she murmured to herself, they'll have it. Maid Lane, torn between family loyalty and her sense of justice, secretly approached Abigail. I can't believe what my mother has done, she confessed, tears in her eyes. I want to help you, Abigail. It's the right thing to do. With Madeleine's help, Abigail obtained crucial evidence about the Rodmans' illegal activities. Documents, recordings, and witnesses began to pile up, forming a solid case not only to keep the lottery prize but also to expose years of exploitation and fraud. The private investigator, seeing where the wind was blowing, tried to negotiate his silence in exchange for immunity. Abigail, hardened by recent events, flatly rejected him. As the case progressed, Abigail realized that the money she had once believed would bring her freedom had become a heavy burden. The suspicious looks from her former co-workers, the whispers behind her back, and the weight of constantly being judged by strangers began to take their toll. One night, exhausted after yet another round of meetings with lawyers, Abigail collapsed in her luxurious hotel room. Looking out the window at the city that never slept, she wondered if she had really won anything. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her lawyer. "Abigail," he said gravely, "we have new information. Something that could change everything." With her heart racing, Abigail listened, realizing that her battle was far from over and that the true test of her character was only just beginning. The new information that Abigail's lawyer had discovered was explosive. Documents showed that Mr. Rodman had been involved in a large-scale money laundering scheme. This revelation not only strengthened Abigail's case but also threatened to completely destroy the Rodman family. Horrified by her father's actions, Maid decided to take a more active role. She approached Abigail with a bold proposal. "Let's work together to expose the whole truth, no matter the consequences for my own family. It's the right thing to do." Abigail, moved by Madeleine's integrity, accepted the alliance. Together, they began to unravel the complex web of lies and corruption surrounding the Rodmans. Meanwhile, the private investigator, sensing that his ship was sinking, made a desperate last attempt. He approached Abigail and Maid with a blackmail offer. He had information that could incriminate both sides, and he was willing to sell it to the highest bidder. Abigail and Maid found themselves at a moral crossroads. Should they pay to silence the investigator and protect their case, or stand firm in their pursuit of the truth, no matter the cost? The decision led them to increasingly questionable actions. Abigail, once a victim, now found herself walking a fine line between justice and revenge. One night, while reviewing documents in Madeleine's apartment, Abigail received a call from her brother. His voice, filled with disappointment, echoed through the speaker. "Abigail, what have you become? This wasn't the dream we had." Her brother's words hit Abigail like a punch. She realized that in her quest for justice, she was losing sight of what really mattered. Maid seeing the anguish in Abigail's eyes, took her hand. "We still have time to do the right thing," she said softly, "but we have to be brave." With the weight of their decisions on their shoulders, Abigail and Maid prepared for the next step, knowing that every move brought them closer to a point of no return. The truth about the origin of the lottery ticket exploded like a bomb in the media. An investigative journalist had discovered that the winning ticket had been purchased with money from a charity fund embezzled by the Rodmans. This revelation shook the foundations of the case and threatened to invalidate the prize. Abigail and the Rodmans were forced into an uneasy truce, united by the need to protect the prize, which now hung by a thread. Both parties' legal teams worked frantically to find a solution that would prevent the total loss of the money. As the legal battle intensified, Abigail's brother suffered a serious relapse. The doctors warned that without immediate and costly intervention, his condition could become irreversible. Abigail found herself torn between fighting for the prize and the urgent need to help her brother. Amidst this chaos, Maid discovered documents implicating her father in an even larger corruption scheme. With a broken heart but determined, she approached Abigail with the evidence. "This could destroy my family forever," Maid said, tears in her eyes, "but it's the right thing to do. We have to expose it." Abigail, physically and emotionally exhausted, faced the hardest decision of her life: use the information to secure the prize and save her brother, or reveal the truth and risk everything in the name of justice. Mr. Rodman, suspecting something was happening, approached Abigail with a desperate offer: drop all accusations and surrender the prize in exchange for her silence about the new discoveries. As Abigail pondered the offer, she received a call from the hospital. Her brother's condition had critically worsened. She needed to make a decision, and fast. With time running out and pressures mounting from all sides, Abigail realized that whatever decision she made would irrevocably change the course of many lives, including her own. The question was no longer just about money or justice but about what kind of person she chose to be in that crucial moment. Fate, with its usual sense of irony, decided to intervene at the most critical moment. As Abigail wrestled with Mr. Rodman's offer and her brother's deteriorating condition, Mrs. Rodman suffered a devastating car accident. The news spread like wildfire through the mansion. Mr. Rodman, pale and trembling, received the call from the hospital. His wife was in critical condition, fighting for her life in the same hospital where Abigail's brother was being treated. When Abigail learned of the accident, she felt a confusing mix of emotions. On the one hand, years of mistreatment and humiliation weighed on her heart. On the other, an unexpected feeling of compassion arose within her. Life, in all its fragility, presented itself to her in a way she had never contemplated before. Maid Lane, devastated by the news, approached Abigail with pleading eyes. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything," she said through sobs, "but please, help us. The lottery money could save my mother." The moral dilemma reached epic proportions. Abigail found herself in the position of deciding the fate of the woman who had hurt her so much. The irony was not lost on her, now she had the power to be cruel or compassionate. At the hospital, Abigail walked through the corridors, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. In one room, her brother was fighting to survive. In another, Mrs. Rodman was battling for her life. Two seemingly opposite lives, now united by the fragility of human existence. The medical team approached Abigail, needing an immediate decision about her brother's treatment. At the same time, Mr. Rodman's lawyer called, urging an answer to his offer. In this critical moment, Abigail realized that her decision would not only determine the fate of the money but also define who she was as a person. Would she choose revenge or compassion? Justice or mercy? With her heart racing and her hands trembling, Abigail prepared to make a decision that would change the course of multiple lives, including her own. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders as she contemplated the true meaning of redemption and forgiveness. In an act that surprised everyone, including herself, Abigail made a decision that no one expected. With a voice firm but laden with emotion, she announced that she would use part of the lottery money to pay for both her brother's treatment and Mrs. Rodman's. "We can't control what happens to us," she said, looking at Maid Lane and Mr. Rodman, "but we can choose how we respond." The news of Abigail's decision quickly spread through the hospital and beyond. Mr. Rodman, overwhelmed by the unexpected compassion, collapsed into a chair, silent tears streaming down his aged face. Maid Lane embraced Abigail, murmuring thanks through her tears. For a moment, the barriers of class and resentment dissolved, leaving only two women united by adversity and hope. However, Abigail's decision did not come without conditions. With the help of her lawyers, she drafted an agreement. In exchange for her assistance, she demanded a full confession from the Rodmans about their illegal activities and fair compensation for all the employees who had been exploited over the years. Mr. Rodman, seeing a chance for redemption, accepted the terms. With a broken voice, he began to reveal years of fraud, tax evasion, and labor abuses. Each word seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, while Maid Lane listened in horror but determined to face the truth about her family. Meanwhile, doctors worked tirelessly to save Mrs. Rodman and improve Abigail's brother's condition. A subtle shift began to manifest in the dynamics between all those involved. Vengeance and resentment slowly gave way to a deeper understanding of human fragility and the possibility of change. As Abigail observed how her decision set off a series of events she never could have imagined, she realized that the real prize wasn't the money, but the opportunity to break the cycle of hatred and resentment. That night, as she sat by her brother's bed, Abigail reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. The path to healing and justice would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a genuine spark of hope. The days following Abigail's agreement were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. As Mrs. Rodman fought for her life in intensive care, Mr. Rodman, consumed by guilt and remorse, began to unravel the complex web of lies and corruption he had woven over the years. In a hospital conference room, temporarily converted into an improvised command center. Abigail, Maid Lane, and a team of lawyers listened attentively to each of Mr. Rodman's confessions. Each revelation was more shocking than the last: bribes to officials, large-scale tax evasion, and even the terrible truth about the charity fund's origin. The lottery ticket, Mr. Rodman confessed with a broken voice, had been bought with money intended for an orphanage. "I thought," he stammered, "that I could return it multiplied if I won." Maid Lane, horrified by her father's actions, struggled to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one now being revealed. Abigail, for her part, felt a mix of vindication and sadness. The justice she had long sought was coming, but at an emotional cost she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Abigail's brother showed signs of improvement thanks to the intensive treatment. Every small progress was a testament to the transformative power of the compassion Abigail had shown. However, the situation was far from resolved. As Mr. Rodman's confessions came to light, new legal and ethical challenges emerged. The lottery prize, now tainted by its questionable origin, became the center of a moral and legal debate. Abigail found herself in the eye of a media and legal storm. Journalists camped outside the hospital, hungry for every juicy detail. Activist groups demanded that the money be returned to the affected charities. Amid this chaos, Abigail received an anonymous note suggesting that there were still more secrets to uncover, secrets that could change everything once again. With her heart racing, Abigail realized that her journey toward truth and justice had only just begun, and every new revelation brought with it fresh moral dilemmas and tough decisions. The anonymity of the note didn't last long. The private investigator, feeling that he was losing control of the situation, decided to play his last card. He showed up at the hospital, his face a mask of desperation and cunning. "I have proof," he said quietly to Abigail and Maid Lane, "that could sink everyone, or save them. It's up to you." Abigail and Maid Lane exchanged worried looks. The investigator showed them compromising photos of Mr. Rodman with high-ranking politicians and documents that suggested a far-reaching corruption network larger than they had ever imagined. "What do you want?" Abigail asked, her voice tense. "Immunity and a share of the prize," he responded without hesitation. The investigator's proposal placed Abigail and Maid Lane in an even greater ethical dilemma. Revealing the full truth could bring justice to many but also destroy lives and shake the foundations of society. Hiding it would make them complicit in the crimes they had sworn to expose. As they debated what to do, Abigail's brother, now more lucid thanks to the treatment, surprised them with his perspective. "Abigail," he said weakly, "remember why all this started. It wasn't about money or revenge, it was about justice and a dignified life." His words deeply resonated with Abigail, reminding her of her core values. Maid Lane, for her part, struggled with family loyalty and her own sense of justice. "If we expose everything," Maid Lane reflected, "not only will my father fall, but so will many others. Do we have the right to decide that?" The tension in the room was palpable. The investigator waited impatiently, aware that his future hung by a thread. Abigail, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was a new determination in her gaze. "We can't play judge," she finally said, "but we also can't be complicit in a cover-up. We'll hand over all the information to the appropriate authorities and let justice take its course." Her decision marked a turning point. The Rodman family, Abigail, and Maid Lane realized that they were now united, not by blood or money, but by a shared search for redemption and truth. The next morning, headlines in all the newspapers and news outlets screamed the story. "Rodman Scandal, Domestic Worker Exposes Corruption Network." Abigail's decision to reveal the entire truth had unleashed an unprecedented media storm. Abigail suddenly found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Journalists camped outside the hospital, eager for every detail of the story. Social media buzzed with debates about ethics, justice, and redemption. In the midst of the chaos, Abigail's brother, now recovered thanks to the treatment, visited her in the hospital. His presence was a powerful reminder of why it had all begun. "I'm proud of you, sister," he said, hugging her tightly, "but are you sure this is what you want? The path you've chosen won't be easy." Abigail, moved by her brother's support, felt her resolve strengthen. "It's the right thing to do," she replied. "I can't build a new life on lies and secrets." Meanwhile, Maid Lane organized a press conference. The young woman, determined to face the situation head-on, planned to make a public statement on behalf of her family. Moments before the press conference began, Abigail received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was grave and threatening. "If you speak, there will be consequences. Some secrets are better left buried." Abigail's heart raced. The threat was clear, but so was her determination. With trembling hands, she told Maid Lane about the call. "We can cancel the press conference," Maid Lane suggested, concerned. "Your safety comes first." Abigail looked at Maid Lane, then at the Rodman family, nervously waiting in the hospital room. She thought of her brother, the charity beneficiaries, and all the lives affected by this web of lies. "No," she finally said, her voice firm despite her fear. "We've come too far to turn back now. The truth has to come out, no matter the consequences." With that decision, Abigail and Maid Lane prepared to face the press and the world. They knew their words would change lives, shake institutions, and possibly put them in danger, but they also knew it was the only path to true redemption. As they walked toward the press room, Abigail felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This was her chance to give a voice to all those who had been silenced by power and corruption. With each step, she reaffirmed her decision to face whatever came, no matter the personal cost. The press conference was an explosive event that shook society to its core. Abigail and Maid Lane, standing side by side, revealed the whole truth without reservations. They spoke about the corruption, the lottery ticket, and how a simple act of desperation had unraveled a web of lies that extended far beyond the Rodman family. As Abigail detailed years of abuse and exploitation, Maid Lane exposed her father's shady dealings and the complicity of powerful figures. The press room was silent, except for the sound of cameras and the occasional gasp of surprise from the journalists. But the real bombshell dropped when Abigail revealed the origin of the charity fund money. It came from illegal activities linked to a cartel. This revelation caused a media earthquake and put authorities on high alert. Within hours, the Rodman mansion was raided by the police. Mr. Rodman, still in the hospital, was placed under custody. The investigation quickly expanded, implicating politicians, businessmen, and even judges. Abigail and the Rodman family found themselves in the eye of the storm. The threats against their lives became real and tangible, so they had to be placed under police protection. Their lives had changed forever. Amid the chaos, Abigail had an epiphany. Looking at Maid Lane, who remained strong despite watching her world crumble, and thinking of her brother, whose life had been saved by this twist of fate, Abigail understood the true value of life and family. All of this, Abigail said to Maid Lane during a quiet moment, started with an act of desperation and revenge, but now I see it's about something much bigger than us. Maid Lane nodded, taking Abigail's hand. "It's about doing the right thing, no matter the cost," she responded. With this understanding, Abigail made a decision that would surprise everyone. She called a meeting with the Rodman family, her brother, their lawyers, and representatives of the affected charities. She had a plan, one that could offer everyone a chance at redemption but would require significant sacrifices. As she prepared to present her idea, Abigail knew she was about to change not only her life but also the lives of many others. The road to true justice and redemption was just beginning, and she was determined to walk it to the end, no matter the obstacles. The hospital conference room became the stage for an unprecedented meeting. With a determination that surprised everyone, Abigail took the floor before the diverse and intense group gathered there. "What I'm about to propose," she began, her voice firm but filled with emotion, "may seem radical, even impossible, but I believe it's our only chance to make things right. Abigail outlined her plan to create a foundation using all the lottery prize money and the recovered assets from the Rodmans' illegal businesses. This foundation would be jointly managed by her, the Rodman family, and representatives of the original charitable organizations. But this isn't just about money, she continued. I propose that we all publicly confess our wrongs, accept the legal consequences, and dedicate our lives to making amends for the harm we've caused. An astonished silence followed her words. The lawyers exchanged incredulous looks while the charity representatives murmured among themselves. Mr. Rodman, pale but resolute, was the first to speak. I've lived a life of lies and greed, he said. I'm willing to face the consequences and do whatever it takes to make things right. Maid Lane, tears in her eyes but her head held high, supported the proposal. I'll use my education and privilege to ensure this foundation truly makes a difference, she promised. Mrs. Rodman, still struggling with her amnesia but moved by the nobility of the plan, nodded silently, squeezing her husband's hand. The representatives of the victims, though skeptical, saw in this proposal a unique opportunity for real justice and restitution. Abigail's brother, now fully recovered, offered his perspective as a direct beneficiary. This plan won't just change our lives, he declared with conviction, but the lives of future generations. As the discussion continued, the tension in the room was palpable. Each person present struggled with their own internal demons, weighing the desire for self-preservation against the possibility of true redemption. Abigail watched the reactions, aware that she was asking for enormous sacrifices from everyone. But she also knew that this was the only path to real and lasting justice. As the debate progressed, one thing became clear: whatever the outcome, nothing would be the same again. The decision they made in that room would not only affect their own lives but would have repercussions throughout society. The silence that followed Abigail's proposal was broken by the sound of the door opening. A man in a suit entered, his imposing presence filling the room. It was the Attorney General, drawn by the magnitude of the case. I've heard your proposal, Miss Abigail, he said gravely. It's admirable, but the law must take its course. The tension in the room increased. Abigail, however, did not back down. With a calmness that surprised everyone, including herself, she addressed the Attorney General. Sir, she said, I understand the need for justice, but isn't true justice about repairing the damage and preventing future crimes? Our proposal does exactly that. The Attorney General looked at her for a long time, evaluating her words. Finally, he nodded slowly. Proceed, he said. With renewed energy, the group worked for hours, refining the details of the plan. Mrs. Rodman, inspired by Abigail's compassion, was the first to sign the agreement. I want to be the person I deserve to be, she said, tears in her eyes. Mr. Rodman followed, accepting to face reduced charges in exchange for his full cooperation. Maid Lane committed to using her skills to ensure the transparency of the foundation. One by one, the representatives of the victims and the lawyers joined the agreement. Abigail's brother offered to be the public face of the foundation, a living testament to its positive impact. When the last document was signed, a collective sense of achievement filled the room. Abigail looked at the tired but hopeful faces and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This is just the beginning, she said quietly. The road to redemption will be long and difficult, but we'll walk it together. The Attorney General, impressed by the group's resolution, offered his support to implement the plan within the legal framework. As the setting sun bathed the room in golden light, Abigail reflected on the incredible journey that had started with a simple lottery ticket. She had sought revenge and found redemption, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. Sometimes, Abigail thought as she looked at the Rodman family, her brother, and Maid Lane, true wealth isn't in money but in the opportunity to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it is. With that thought, the group dispersed, each carrying the responsibility of a new beginning and the promise of a better future, not only for them but for all those whose lives they would touch through their work with the foundation. The story of Abigail, the Rodman family, and the lottery ticket would become a symbol of transformation and hope, reminding everyone that even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of true redemption and change. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the story. I'm sure the next video appearing on your screen will move you as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos. A big kiss, and see you in the next story.